There's been a significant decline in the spread of HIV cases, but patients still face a lot of discrimination. We hope that these programs will spread awareness and reduce discrimination.
In India, more than 2 million people live with HIV. It's the country with the third largest epidemic in the world. But it could have been a lot worse. 20 years ago, the virus that causes AIDS was spreading fast. Every day, 1,000 new cases were emerging. And if things didn't improve, health experts warned that more than 20 million people would be infected within a matter of only a few years. It looked as though India was going to become the AIDS capital of the world. But something stopped that from happening, and many put it down to the work of this man, Ashok Alexander. He joins us now from New Delhi. Ashok Alexander developed the world's largest HIV prevention program with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He now leads the Antara Foundation, a nonprofit focused on public health. Ashok, thanks so much for joining us. You know, a number of decades ago, it was predicted by some that India would almost go down in flames, that the HIV/AIDS epidemic was going to spread so out of control that countless people would be killed even. Instead, it became a success story on fighting the spread of HIV. You and the sex workers that you cooperated with are credited with a lot of that success. Tell me how it happened.
Well, first let me just say that nearly all the credit for this work should go to the sex workers, because this was a highly stigmatized group, but more than that, was an invisible group. Sex work in India is not practiced in brothels, so there's not an obvious place where sex workers congregate. So they were invisible, practicing on the street, but it wasn't clear who was a sex worker. Moreover, there was very little data, how many they were moving around. For all these reasons, we had to have the partnership and the collaboration with the sex workers to even approach the problem. And they did that in very clever ways. Many of these solutions were ones they devised on their own.
They devised them on their own, you say? And how so? What did they discover that you actually couldn't teach them?
Well, there were two things. One is a very basic thing. When you do HIV prevention, you need to know what we call the denominator. How many sex workers are there in a particular place? And having done that, you also need to, what in business parlance we would call, segment that market to understand the ones that have more clients, who are at more risky positions, who couldn't negotiate condom usage. There's no way that an outside agency like ours or anyone could do that, because this community can't be seen, as I said, and they don't even really talk to outsiders. So the sex workers became perhaps a huge sales force, if you will, 8,000 or 9,000 of them working across India, talking to their sisters and getting the kind of intimate information that a sex worker will only give to another sex worker. So because of that, we were able to pinpoint the number of sex workers and how many of them were the ones most at risk, most vulnerable. But there was also something else that happened, which was extremely interesting, perhaps even more important. Sex workers, you have to understand at that time, were not sitting around saying, give us condoms or tell us about condoms so that we can be safe. They had far bigger problems on their mind. They didn't really need education on condoms. They, as one of them told me, try to understand why I don't use a condom when I know it's important. And that was a clue, because the reason sex workers didn't use condoms as much as they should have was because of the violence that they lived with. Typically, in a transaction with the client would insist on, demand unprotected sex. She would try to plead with him otherwise. That would lead to a violent transaction. He would beat her. She might be burned. Something worse than that could happen. And with the result that there was no condom usage. So her point was this, very simply and very, very deeply, I would say, try to make us safe from violence, and condom usage will follow. Now, This is not an easy, to say, let's make society free from violence. I found the words coming out of my mouth automatically. Well, how do you do that? I don't have a clue. I'd spent 17 years with McKinsey and Company, and we fancied ourselves problem solvers. And once again, it's the women who came up with the solution to that. They basically said, let's form teams of 12 to 15 women, who, as soon as one of them was picked up, and you've got to understand, a lot of the problem came from the police themselves. They would show up, make a hue and cry, uh, be accompanied by a pro bono lawyer or a media person. And the police would not only back down, they would actually plead that this not be taken any further. So the HIV prevention program became a anti-violence campaign. And then in today's parlance, it just went viral because when we fought violence so effectively, condom usage also was enforced by the women themselves.
It is very multi-layered, this problem in India. And in the meantime, though, at the beginning, you were getting private backing from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. What about government backing? I mean, is the Indian government doing enough now, having seen the success you've had, to invest in people that it feels are on the margin? And as you said yourself, the police often don't want to even deal with. And do you think the world is doing a good enough job to acknowledge the needs of this community in societies throughout the planet to stop the spread of these infections and to stop the sexual violence as well?
Well, I think the Indian government should get a lot of credit because things changed. In the beginning, I think there was a state of, I would say, sheer denial that India had any kind of problem at all. I mean, there was global concern and alarm at where things were going in India, but the government of India was at that point in time in denial. 5 years later, they had a fully funded program which was very actively taken up by the government. So the government did show that it could change its stance. Today, we withdrew from this, many years ago, transferred our work to government. Government is now a multi-component program, far more visionary, I would say, than most countries in the world. It's all there. Okay. It's well funded. It's running well. Yeah.
It's good to hear. I mean, India still is among, though, the worst, unfortunately, in the world for the number of HIV/AIDS cases. I think we said it was number 3, actually. So work still needs to be done, but do you think the best is being done to address the problem?
Yeah, I think we should also keep in mind that India has a huge population. By its very nature, nearly everything will be second or third in the world. It's the prevalence that matters, the number of HIV positive people in a given unit of population. And on that count, India is one of the lowest prevalence countries in the world right now. But there are still places which are at a very alarming level of HIV. The northeast portions of India, which abut the so-called Golden Triangle, are sources of where very low-cost heroin and other drugs come in. So injecting drug use is a very, very complex issue compared to sex work transmitted HIV. That remains a big concern.
Ashok, we just have a short time left, so I want to ask you more of a personal question. I mean, you went from being surrounded by the world's business and political elites by virtue of where you were born, as well as being trained as a consultant for one of the top consulting firms in the world, to being surrounded by what many consider really the dregs of society, if I can put it like that. Where did you yourself, in the end, actually feel more comfortable? Where were you happiest?
I think it's very clear. I was more happy trudging through brothels and engaging with sex workers all over India. I like to think I'm beloved of sex workers all over India. I enjoyed that more because I felt that these are real people. These are brave people, and they actually have a form of leadership far better than those that I encountered with corporate leaders. They're human beings who are selfless, they're dedicated, very intelligent. And every time I came back from field and landed in New Delhi, I've got to say that was more of a downer to me. And that's the way it was for 10 years.
Ashok Alexander, unfortunately, we will have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on The Newsmakers.